Good morning, everyone. I realise it's very warm in here, so you might need to peel off the layers a little bit. First of all, thank you, Clive, for that very special introduction. It was great to hear the words also of Kabina Mercer, who was obviously so seminal in the 1988 conference. I want to thank Annemiek and Clive for setting up today, and I think it was initially just an idea, as Clive said, and it's resulted in a very, a very full room, which is great to see, and I really am confident the next 2 days will be a landmark really in how we think about film, national identity, and culture. Now, 30 years ago, when this conference was taking place, when the pioneers in making and thinking about black cultural production were assembling, I was a young undergraduate about to start my degree at the University of Sussex in English and Media Studies. So the timing was actually very significant in terms of my own development, because that conference and the subsequent ICA document number 7, which is now virtually impossible to get hold of, really did become highly influential for me, but also for other scholars, practitioners, who wanted to think about the relationship between film culture and the formation of national identities. And so it's really great to be able to add my voice to this important, as Kabina highlighted in his notes, very timely anniversary. Now, as transformative as that first conference was, I want to revisit why those debates mattered, but I also want to take up one of the questions of this conference's call for papers, which is what has become and what has not become of black British cinema. And my chosen focus, and I recognise that it is just one aspect of black British cinema, is on films that you might call sort of social commentary films, films that have involved a significant black presence in the means of production. And one of the reasons for my focus is that actually those films were so central to those early debates that happened in the 1980s. And I want to argue today that black British film has been a key site of struggle, which has been more or less racially governed through various frames, such as commissioning cultures, through institutionalised diversity, through the creative economy paradigm. But I also want to say that it has demonstrated radical potential as a form of culture that's been able to provoke, disrupt, and recode normative understandings of the British experience, not just black British experience. And also, in what's now being described as a post-cinema age, I want to go on to suggest the importance of how we might, in current context, which Kabina alluded to, strategize around spaces of representation from which black film might be able to resist the current racialized forms of governance that it's experienced, whether in terms of commissioning, funding, distribution, or policy. Now, when I use black, and it's almost like, you have to do this, you have to explain your terminology, but I will do that. When I use black, I take my cue from the way it was actually referenced in that moment in the 1980s, which was, to use Stuart Hall's words, with deliberate imprecision, not as a sign of a genetic imprint, but as a signifier of difference. So this is an idea of black as an umbrella political term which historically forged progressive alliances, including amongst filmmakers themselves, between those of African, Asian, and Caribbean heritage in the UK, whilst always recognising the instability of that term black, the way that it can itself become a form of governance, and its overdetermination, therefore, by a set of social relations. And I want to think today about the social, political, economic, and effective structures through which visual culture is constituted. So this is a kind of thicker sense of the shifting role and value of what has variously been described as oppositional film culture or cinema of resistance. And I'm going to combine some personal reflections with a social and cultural historical review in order to identify what I see as some of the shifting structures of governance and power that have helped shape it. So a lot of this is about setting the scene and positioning that conference in context. So my talk is arranged around 3 interrelated phases, organised in the classic 3-act structure, representing each of the 3 decades that have passed, But I also recognise that these three phases have as much in common as what sets them apart. A lot has been said and written about the Black British art movement of the 1980s, making it all the more difficult to grapple with its demise. Retrospectives are justifiably nostalgic, but the act of remembering is also selective and can serve as a form of catharsis. And so I think it's very interesting how in 2017 people are assembling to remember Black Film British Cinema version 1. And earlier this month I attended a symposium marking the 30-year anniversary of the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies book, The Empire Strikes Back, a book about the construction of an authoritarian state in Britain that it fundamentally linked to the growth of popular racism in the 1970s. Now, although race, culture and identity are always being constituted by geopolitical transformations, this is always a dynamic process, it seems to me that the idea of blackness is today deeply situated within a new cultural politics of difference, being shaped by crisis. Again, Kabina alluded to this, articulated as a rising xenophobia forming the basis of populist movements, partly fueled by the media as we know, thus building on a post-war history of racism and anti-racism in British culture and society. A new exclusionary idea of national belonging has surfaced. And if we think back to what Theresa May said at the Tory party conference last year, a very interesting sentence, she said, if you believe you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. Now, I think that chimes very much with the anti-immigrant rhetoric that framed the 2016 referendum campaign by repudiating globalisation, repudiating hybridity and so-called unassimilable forms of cultural difference. It acts as a direct negation of the idea of diasporic belonging that was so central to those debates in the 1980s. At the same time, the everyday encounters, modes of practice, and creative tussles that so-called minority producers now increasingly have to collude with, or indeed collide with, is a requirement for the paradigmatic creative economy that has forcefully come to characterise culture itself. So the politics of representation that Stuart Hall spoke of in his seminal piece, New Ethnicities, delivered at the 1988 ICA conference, has accumulated new meanings, I would argue, and still coincides with ongoing claims for fairer representation. And all of this really sets the context for what I want to talk about today. Thinking back to the 1980s, so this is kind of act one in my talk, if you like, this period of 1987 to 1997, this first decade. Thinking back to the 1980s, openness, critical, intellectual, radical openness was a key feature of this moment of complexity and theoretical intervention. And so for students such as myself who were developing an interest in the relationship between culture, identity and representation, it was incredibly exciting. Now, on the one hand, as we look back, this was a moment of hopefulness for the future of black cultural production. You can feel that energy when you go back and read the ICA document. On the other, it rather depressingly prophesied some of the complexities that black film is still tied up in today. Now, the title, Black Film British Cinema, was itself very powerful. Black film as Britishness was not just the underlying provocation, but an assertion, putting black cultural production within, not outside, and thus opening up the space of the national at a time when the notion of Britishness was itself being heavily contested. But so too was the implication in the title that film, black and otherwise, can and does occupy the space of the more highbrow sounding cinema, which is obviously much more spectator orientated, inviting a direct probing of both the distinction between high and low culture and between different kinds of visual orders or scopic regimes, to use Christian Metz's term. Even in these apparently simple ways then, it set in motion critical and still radical debates at the intersection of screen and cultural theory, based around an enthusiastic interdisciplinarity converging in a unique and more open form of critical race studies film criticism. So in many ways it was ahead of its time. It approached screen theory in its broadest sense, suggesting intermediality that connected films with other spaces such as television, literature and visual culture. Of course, on a practical level, we know that film and television in the UK context has always had a very close relationship in terms of personnel, in terms of funding, in terms of distribution, exhibition, and increasingly in terms of economic and cultural objectives, as I'll go on to discuss. Channel 4, for example, supported many of these films through funding and screenings in cinemas before transmission. Now, participants in 1988 were, as they are at today's conference, academics, critics, curators, programmers, thus building a very inclusive and collaborative way of thinking about the field. The interdependence of theory and practice, encouraged through the influence and support of major scholars such as Stuart Hall, also helped produce a form of critical openness. Now, the cultural turn described by Stuart Hall in New Ethnicities represented what Hall called the end of the innocent notion of the essential black subject. Now, this was an acceptance that not all black films are good, and I think we have to accept that, and I think we know that. Or not all black films need to be engaged in social commentary or anything else for that matter. So it was very much about opening up the idea of what blackness actually constitutes. A new liberatory position actually from which the black artist or filmmaker could speak, and a more diverse expectation of black representation to articulate difference, not just across communities and individuals, but within them as well. Hall pinpointed this transformational politics as, to quote, a change from a struggle over the relations of representation to a politics of representation itself. So it became much less about access and much more about decoding what such representation actually means. Now, this seminal conceptualization of Britain's new multiculturalism in the mid to late 1980s, early 1990s, was influenced, of course, by feature films such as My Beautiful Laundrette, Looking for Langston, and Young Soul Rebels, but also from shorter films produced at the time. Now, culture in that moment offered some revelatory potential. It was also a space where deep exclusions were at work. The retrospectively globally acclaimed independent workshop movements such as Black Audio Film Collective, Sankofa and Chedo sought deliberately to make audiences more self-reflexive, precisely through the recoding of dominant racialised discourses, such as those that have been screened on British television, for example, particularly in realist formats. These new ethnicities emerged against the backdrop then of racial exclusion, also of racial violence and social divide, signalling the paradoxes of black cultural production and perhaps, and this is something we can think about, the necessary conditions for this kind of radical grassroots intervention through film. Thus, black artists were generating self-representational practices, but this was also made possible by a certain level of institutional support. The governing context of 1980s multiculturalism, a liberal principle predicated very much on this idea of mutual coexistence, was deliberately agitated by the more radical expressions of municipal anti-racist politics inscribed in the Labour local authorities as a response to the 1981 riots and to Scarman's report, as well as exploiting opportunities provided by existing race relations legislation and central government funding. Whilst many films were made in conditions of self-organisation and relative independence, I suppose what I'm trying to draw attention to here is that local and national public policy was also one of the conditions through which black cultural production arose. So the state occupied this kind of contradictory space, whilst the law, police, education, and indeed the media were implicated in the structures of racism, which also intersected with a deep class bias in what was to become known later as institutional racism in the Lawrence McPherson moment of the late 1990s. The state also had its own approaches to the management of culture. Publicly funded avenues such as the Greater London Council, GLC, local authority, as McRobbie has noted, helped support, for example, disadvantaged students through local democracy in the form of studentships, part-time jobs, and subsidised shared housing for artists under the council's remit. In the same year that it set up its Black Arts Centre, 1985, the GLC supported the Third Eye Film Festival, attempting to as they put it, give black filmmakers a place to promote and show their films. The 1982 Workshop Declaration had provided financial security and new audiences for the independent sector, and it had evolved from discussions between the Independent Filmmakers Association, the BFI, Channel 4 and ACT. It had an integrative practice model, and the franchise workshops that it supported came from outside of the mainstream of film and television culture, with a particular focus on ethnic diversity and a commitment to local issues. Creatively, there was a new emphasis in the films that were emerging on syncretism, not integration, on fluidity, not fixity, on the processes of differentiation as much as the differences themselves. Films such as Sankofa's Territories moved away, for example, from the social realist aesthetic of the 1970s and early 1980s towards the more experimental aesthetics of the late 1980s and 90s. As a deconstructive documentary, what it did was assemble intermittent imagery with repetitive voiceover and eclectic source music. The first part of Territories, what it does is it assembles official documentary footage of the Notting Hill Carnival, and the second part shows two filmmakers deconstructing that footage, thus implicitly mobilizing a critique of the established documentary realist mode and media stereotyping of the carnival, which was, and still is, a real issue. What came into being then through black film production was a range of collective creative interventions where the aesthetic, the interruptive, and the interrogative were converging to assert a critical visual presence. We might think of this as a process of what Bell Hooks has called radical openness, a disruptive practice emanating from spaces that have actually been marginalised through structural inequalities, as we know was happening at this time, but also spaces that have been chosen and that are required to, as Hooks put it, conceptualise alternatives, often improvised. Thus, the lived experience of marginality becomes not just about deprivation, but also as sites of resistance and radical possibility, chosen as a critical response to domination, reformulated here as a progressive coalition of race, gender, sexuality, and class politics now being articulated through film. And when it comes to cultural criticism, Isaac Julian and Kabina Mercer mobilised a critique of how film theory, exemplified by the Screen Journal from whose pages they were now writing, to quote from them, participated in a phase of British left culture that inadvertently marginalised race and ethnicity as a consequence of the centrifugal tendency of its high theory. The BFI's African Caribbean unit's publication of the Black Film Bulletin magazine was to become, in the mid-1990s, so slightly later in this decade, a significant platform for what its editor, June Giovanni, has described as facilitating, to quote, a depth of cross-collaborative ideas and intersectional dialogues that acted symbolically as a transgenerational critical intervention on black creative tradition. So what we're getting is this opening up and directly subverting film theory, British film culture from within. But to insist again and remind us of the diversity within black British film. Not all work was political in the same way, some much less overtly, and other work operates in very different spaces. Curator and scholar Eddie Chambers has spoken about what he calls a profound not knowing about the range of black British artists' participation more widely. Carol Dixon, for example, points to the problem of the prioritisation of certain archival repositories and research collections, also inevitably shaped by access to those, and which have led to the dominance of certain kinds of narrative repositories. And one critical question is whether the anti-racist, highly politicised film culture that I'm talking about and that this decade is best known for, whether it might have also produced its own iterative and essentialised typologies of black cultural production that may have even limited the boundaries of others' experimentalism at the time. Now, for all of this, my kind of final observation of Act One, this first decade, is that it generated a perhaps impossible burden of expectation about the kinds of cultural possibilities to follow. especially against the powerful effects of the emerging neoliberalism that was to impact on the cultural terrain in Act 2, which focuses on the next decade, 1997 to 2007. So if the 1980s was marked by these kinds of openings and connectivity, the mid to late 1990s was about, I want to suggest, closure and fragmentation. Those few spaces and funding streams which explicitly supported black film in the 1980s no longer existed or were, in this decade, revising their policies in line with new cultural imperatives. By the end of this period, the practical legacy of what had happened in the 1980s seemed quite ephemeral. By now, I was based at the BFI in the final stages of submitting my PhD on black representation on television. I saw a thriving African Caribbean unit at the BFI, one of the few institutional spaces specifically geared towards supporting the exhibition and its critical momentum around black, British and diaspora cinemas. But I also went on to witness its demise in late 1996. There was some institutional support with partial funding from the BFI, BBC Films, Film 4 or the Arts Council Lottery Fund. Notable amongst these were films such as Welcome to the Terrordome, My Son the Fanatic, and Akumfra's Speak Like a Child. So there was institutional support as well, which kind of was happening in parallel with these closures that I want to emphasise. When the new Labour regime came to office in 1997, it inaugurated a new process of disavowal of and a disavowal of the history of left, feminist and anti-racist work in what Robbie has termed the complexification of backlash. Both multiculturalism and anti-racism that had made all that headway in the 80s were now being derided in wider public discourse, and resources were being reallocated, now assuming that ethnic minority groups of the 70s and 80s had been, to quote Channel 4's CEO at that time, Michael Jackson, he said in 2001, those ethnic minorities have now been assimilated into the mainstream of society. By now, I was working in the cash-strapped arts sector, leading on the cultural programming of Asian arts. The effect on black arts through the curtailment of the power of local government by the incoming regime was clear to see, and so too was the requirement to programme more populist, commercially driven work in order to break even. Some have argued about the inevitability of public monies being retracted. Chambers, in his recent book, Things Done Change, argues that the process of state funding, by its very nature, as he puts it, often consigns what it touches to failure, disappointment, or a disempowering and moribund existence. Sociologists such as Les Back, but also Hall in 2003, commented on the weakening in commitment to social democratic reforms and its determination to modernise through expanding neoliberal policies. Indeed, film policy, and this is the really interesting thing for us, was to become one of the areas in which New Labour immediately intervened upon entering government, and the arts and culture more widely became a subject of political interest, influencing cultural policy directions, including how the creative economy was to become a central policy object. One of New Labour's legacies was the UK Film Council, set up in 2000 to bring about the sustainability to the UK film industry, but which, according to Philip Schlesinger, who's done extensive work on the life cycle of the UK Film Council, says did not fundamentally change anything in this regard. New Labour's first Culture Secretary, Chris Smith, announced the Rebranding UK Cultural Project, designed to transform its cultural image from the national heritage culture to what was now being famously termed, and we know it well, Cool Britannia. This marked the monetisation of the UK's creative sector and an increasingly economic dimension in how culture was to be perceived. This is something that academics such as Hesmontal have spoken about. For Smith, to quote, he says, "As a new government, we have recognised the importance of this whole industrial sector that no one hitherto conceived of as industry." But this wasn't the only story, because the political climate had also changed and was also developing in other ways in the late 1990s. The choice for publics, as Jeremy Gilbert has put it recently, was now between a cosmopolitan version of neoliberalism represented by New Labour or a new right authoritarianism that had turned openly towards nationalistic populism as a strategic response to the consequences of globalisation. Clearly, I would say, setting in motion what we're experiencing today. The rejection of the publicly funded provisions of multiculturalism was one of the signs of what has been termed the end of multiculturalism. A shift was now taking place towards the more innocuous idea of cultural diversity and a reconstruction of assimilationist policies such as social cohesion. So a process of managerialism through depoliticisation infused from above involves separating the idea of state from the idea of structure, which obviously sat in great contrast to the findings of the Macpherson report in 1999. Furthermore, the accompanying fragmentation of the notion black that had made headway in the previous decade also led, I want to suggest, to the demise of critical voices of solidarity, including through film. The significant demise of a strong black British political movement was therefore abetted by the neoliberal institutionalisation of anti-racist activities. This is something that Elliot Cooper has written about, but also by the rise in black British social conservatism, characterised, according to Warmington, by deliberate breaks with the social analysis developed by the black and anti-racist left. Concurrently, the limits of the notion black, as Hall acknowledged himself in the mid-2000s, was under question and was by now needing to be addressed because, to quote from Hall, in the age of refugees, asylum seekers and global dispersal, black will no longer do. And I think that's something we can also talk about given the title of this conference. With a premium on entertainment that would now be produced on a freelance contract basis, a shift had taken place, also being mirrored within the television industry between a focus on films and programmes and genres to a focus now on industry and economy. Within these new working contexts, there was now even less room for failure. The short film format was probably one of the most valuable spaces actually for film experimentation, and we only need to look at the sort of career trajectory of someone like Steve McQueen, who made his first film in 1993 whilst here at Goldsmiths, a 10-minute film called Bear, to his journey then to becoming the first black filmmaker to win an Academy Award for Best Picture with 12 Years a Slave in 2013. Following a certain process of self-scrutiny about the politics of mainstreaming during the 1990s, it was British Asian cinema, and note how it becomes possible to now speak of British Asian cinema, that experienced flashes of hypervisibility. Perhaps a template for this was Gurinder Chadha's 1992 first feature, Bargee and the Beach, which was very popular, but also very critical in its own way of ideas of Britishness. As I wrote at the time, Asian Britons were now becoming the incumbents of a globalised modern kind of creative culture. And this is the point at which the Bollywoodisation of British culture becomes especially rife. This, of course, is also compatible with the new internationalism represented by the aspirations and mechanisms put in place for the idea of going global. By reaching an audience way beyond the art house and festival circuit, films such as East is East and Bend It Like Beckham facilitated a commercially successful celebration of multicultural pluralism. And I want to show a very brief clip of East is East.
Where'd you put his things?
Look what he's got in the box, ma'am.
Oh. You dirty little bastard.
Mum, it's art.
Oh, you and Emily, you dirty little sod. I'll burn the bleeding thing. Oh, give me the next thing! with this jolly family of half-breeds? Well, they may be half-bred, but at least they're not friggin' inbred like them two monstrosities. Never mind, Ella, who the frig do you think you are? Coming in here telling me that my house isn't good enough for your daughters. Well, your daughters aren't good enough for my sons, or my house. And if I hear another word against my family, I will stick that fanny over your bastard head.
Your wife's a disgrace.
I'd go and piss off.
Go on, fling your green milk. Go on, piss off. Piss off out of my house. And take Laura and Hardy with you.
Okay, no, I thought we needed a bit of light relief given how early it is. Now, I'm quite generous on Easter's Eve, so I've written about it. I mean, the film won a BAFTA award. It was a major, beyond expectation, UK box office success, which was then becoming a kind of form of evaluating British Asian, Black British cinema. It's a semi-autobiographical melodrama, very broad-based appeal, touches on universal themes of love and generational conflict and alienation through this, spectacle of 1970s popular paraphernalia such as space hoppers and parka coats and bell-bottoms. And it can be read as transgressing the archetypal social whiteness of the British period drama film by offering this cross-cultural version of Britishness. However, it was also critiqued very heavily at the time for hinging on this slippery line between laughing at and laughing with, in this case, British Pakistanis. And the darker moments of the film, in which we see domestic violence led by George Khan, was explicitly located within a context that links Islam with patriarchy. It thus risks being incorporated into the dominant forms of articulating the other, and so it contains that kind of ambivalence. What is perhaps more relevant for this discussion, in which we're talking about the conditions in which films get made, are the lengths that Ayub Khan Din, the writer, had to go to even get the film commissioned. The Irish director Damien O'Donnell was a calculated choice for Khan Din because he says, if I'd used an Asian director, it would have been put on the back burner or been turned into something like a Screen 2. And I think that's very telling about actually the stories of actually coming to screen. All black filmmakers were now being measured against these few British Asian successes that were triumphing against the odds, and that inadvertently inferred the existence of a meritocratic cultural industry. This idea that actually if the films are good, well, they will be successful. Of course, the common reality was that, for many, they had much more, for the majority, much more modest film careers. And there were important British Asian filmmakers such as Yogesh Valia, Rahul Amin, Ahmed Jamal, who, by this stage were certainly not in a position to have these high-profile features. And I'm very fascinated by these divergent trajectories of black and Asian British cinema at this point in the 90s. And I would say it reveals to us something very interesting about the racial economies of contemporary British cinema, where the culture clash comedy drama became a template for a new desirable incarnation of British Asian cinema, the urban, crime, youth drama, which I think is taken up as a sign of potential disorder, becomes the trope of black film in this moment. But institutionally, black and British Asian films were coded more systematically, so we get this terminology within institutions such as specialised, cultural, minority, or urban cinema, all coded terms, so, which makes it clear really how these cinemas were not being treated in the same way or positioned at the centre of British cinema. This brings to mind these divergent trajectories that I'm so fascinated by. It brings to mind a piece by Benson titled Asians Have Culture, West Indians Have Problems, and Gilroy's apparently prophetic claim in a 1983 Screen article that where West Indian culture is weak, Asian communities suffer from a surfeit of culture that is too strong, alluding really to these different ways, coded ways, in which ideas of cultural difference are actually constituted. So the lens through which these films of variable box office success, if we're to use that as a measure, came into being is, I'm suggesting, acutely racialised and highly managed within a now much more commercially orientated culture industry, serving as cloned and low-risk formulas precisely because they orientated around the pathologisation of cultural differences. Now, the developments that I've been outlining in this second decade in terms of racialised forms of governance and the intensification of capital also institute much of what is to happen in the next decade, or Act 3, which is the period starting from 2007 and bringing us up to our present day. In this past decade, I'd moved from working in the arts to being having a more decisive academic career in order to focus my research on these connections between social change, marginalisation and cultural representation and production. And so to Act 3, our final decade. Obviously, in any act of historicisation, it's very difficult to grapple with the present, but I'm going to give it a shot. Now, just as post-multiculturalism and now post-racial become part of the post-signalling tendency, some have argued that film has now well and truly left the cinema, resulting in a post-cinema age. The end of medium specificity has been widely proclaimed. Significant developments in the technological environment have involved the displacement of 35mm and analogue film towards digital formats, and YouTube started at the end of the last decade that we spoke about in 2005. And so this golden age of independent filmmaking has been hailed, with an idea that the economics of production will now be under the management of filmmakers themselves. Film has been therefore rendered free of the constraints of cinema. We find it in the gallery, find it in, on the street, on planes, in cars, and of course in new digital communication platforms, enabling what Hagener calls a low end of the circulation of filmic images, and informal networks of exchange and transaction are taking place. Digital potential is equated with the promise of an updated modality of relative independence, equality, and connectivity that can take place outside of institutional spaces, and where new political and social transformations seem more possible precisely through these new forms of circulation and presentation. Now, where I think it's useful for this question about the politics of production is that it potentially weakens the hierarchical structures of power and representation, and therefore enables us to think about the optimum spaces of representation through which black film might be produced today. In different ways, black British filmmakers are demonstrating a diversity of practice, sometimes with institutional support. Notable here are John Acumphra's BFI-supported Sundance Award-winning film, The Stuart Hall Project, distributed just a few months before Stuart's passing in 2014, which has signalled a revival, a really fascinating revival, in the interest, mainly in the art and scholarly world, I have to say, an interest in Acumphra's career, but also to an extent in black British visual culture. Amara Sante's romantic period drama Belle, taken up for UK distribution by Fox Searchlight Pictures, makes a particular kind of intervention in terms of the vexed issue of distribution, an issue which was briefly a topic of public debate when it came to distributing the low-budget US satirical feature Dear White People in 2014. And of course she's got a United Kingdom also coming out. And I want to show a brief clip now of George Amponsa's 2015 observational documentary feature, which was BFI supported and BAFTA nominated, called The Hard Stop, named after the police procedure, which tells the story of Mark Duggan's death in 2011 that was followed by the London riots.
Kids are no better off by me being straight. In fact, we've struggled a hell of a lot more since I've been doing the right thing. You know what I mean? And it's like, I'm tempted to go back on the streets and earn my pee that way, but obviously I'm not going to, because like I just said, I've got my little ones now. It's not about me anymore, it's about them. certain things that I've done in the past, and it's still coming back to haunt me now. So it's like where they say that they don't mind, they don't discriminate against you if you've been to prison, and that's all bollocks, because they do all the time.
This is Tottenham High Road where the riots began.
They thought they could keep Tottenham quiet. Next thing you know, there's a Tottenham riot. We don't believe you, don't try it. Conspiracy, fuck this, we just don't buy it. They thought they could keep Tottenham quiet.
It's the police station on my right, you understand? This is where we all gathered out for the peace protests, you understand? We've gone to the police station, basically demanding answers to why Mark had been shot. We stood out there for 6 hours for them to turn us away and tell us to clear the streets. I was just blown away, so I said to myself, if I leave this high road, I'll mash up one of these police officers. I'd end up just losing it and smashing up a police car. From that, it was a domino effect.
The riots that followed weren't all about Mark Duggan. There was already tension between police in Tottenham and members of the black community. The killing was the spark.
The people in Tottenham, we stood for a reason, innit? We stood to protest. Obviously, we never planned to riot, but through frustration, it's just turned that way. It literally hurt me when I saw that certain people coming on TV and saying how people are breaking into their houses. I'm witnessing it on the news. I'm seeing them ripping open their windows. Like, what's that about? Come on, again, we're supposed to be standing united against the government, again, for the different oppressions they've put us through. Witnessing everything that hurt me still. And them man, they should be ashamed of themselves.
Okay. I mean, I suppose the reason why I wanted to show that is because the film really shares some of the traits of some of the earlier deconstructive documentaries, such as, you know, Handsworth Songs most famously. You know, it assembles mainstream media representation of the Duggan killing alongside personal testimonies, retelling it from an alternative perspective. And it also links the shooting of Duggan with the Cynthia Jarrett shooting in the 1980s. So it's part of a broader tradition of, you know, led by black visual artists, of referencing the conditions, nature and occurrence of riots in the making of Black Britain's vexed history, something that Chambers has explored recently. And therefore it serves as a really good example of radical potential in recent black cinema. But what I also want to go on to talk about is that the moment of capital has also intensified with an acceleration of cultural commodification, coupled with financial austerity, most obviously since 2008, restricting sort of publicly funded spaces for creative exchange and production. The political theorist Chantal Mouffe says that not even in art is there space today for resistance to the control of capital, arguing that this is problematic because a well-functioning democracy requires a confrontation of democratic political position. This defers us to a kind of state of creative hopelessness, which I don't think quite captures where we are, but I do think that some caution is required, particularly when we take note of two other dominant trends that I want to briefly touch on. The first is that in spite of the post-racial signalling, industry data continues to report the real systemic inequalities in the film sector, particularly behind the scenes. So Creative Skill Sets 2012 employment census, which has now been much discussed because of its really depressing figures, shows that BAME, to use the term that they use, employment in the film production sector fell from around 10% to 3% between 2009 and 2012. The work of O'Brien and Oakley in their review of cultural value and inequality, and the work of the Warwick Commission also evidences a really deep connection between the social and cultural inequality in the creative sector, which is really about kind of limited opportunity, which has also led to this notion of black flight, where black acting and directorial talent has progressively moved to the US for recognition. I would add also a lot of academics have moved there as well. And in turn, this has kind of created a sort of set of really perverse recent discussions about black British actors taking away the work of black US actors, which I think is just fascinating. And the second thing that I want to touch on briefly is that these inequalities have been restated again and again. So this is nothing new. And yet, what we're seeing within the industry is that diversity initiatives are gaining traction like never before. And I think this is also fascinating. You know, in late 2016, BAFTA announced new initiatives to boost the numbers of ethnic minority and socially disadvantaged filmmakers, this is their terminology, which includes plans for more diverse membership and reworked eligibility criteria for some of its award categories. The BFI is building on its 3 Ticks initiative. I won't go into detail there, there's probably someone here from the BFI that can speak to that. I'll quote the BFI CEO Amanda Neville, who said in 2015 that diversity is good for creativity, it supports economic growth, taps into underserved audiences, underserved audiences, and makes for good business sense. In another interview, she talks about creativity and fiscal policy working hand in hand. She also says that this will make the UK the most exciting place to do business, place on the planet to do business. But that was before Brexit, just thinking about it. And for Channel 4's CEO, he says that diversity, to quote, is going to be a lifetime's effort, but we can begin to look back now on the first steps to progress. And I think that language is really interesting. And I've written elsewhere about the diversity model, this new diversity model, as what I see as a form of depoliticisation. You know, let's note, even in this story, the trajectory from anti-racism, multiculturalism to cultural diversity to today's creative diversity. There's a new focus on talent, a talent-led economy, on training, on extreme competition, which is part of this overarching creative economy enterprise that in any case never had as its priority the tackling of systemic structural inequalities. And as Annemiek Sahar has reminded us, cultural workers, including black filmmakers, are themselves implicated in an industry that has shifted towards these neoliberal market models. So it's not simply the case that these diversity models, themselves forms of governance, are resisted. The art of acquiescence, as I call it, is required if one wants funding, if one wants to be supported by these kind of central institutionalised spaces. So if the 70s to 80s was the moment when race had become, as Stuart Hall put it, fully indigenised, then this is the decade that institutionalised diversity trumped it, because race is very rarely named in these kind of policy paradigms, in these new governing contexts. And I see this as a process of actually defining racism out of its existence as an ideological and discursive mechanism and a form of, to use Goldberg's concept, racial neoliberalism, where race and racism, as Goldberg so brilliantly puts it, are being buried alive. Institutionalised diversity functions as what Herman Gray describes as a technology of power, a means of managing the very difference it expresses. And so our current moments have been characterised as one involving both restraint and yet transformative possibility. Nana Aduse-Poku talks about any transformation now happening as likely to take place outside of institutions, a performative approach as she puts it. This conjuncture comes into being precisely because of the technological and related economic evolution through which it's been claimed visual culture and politics and digitality can converge. But its backdrop is what we need to understand as ongoing institutionalised failures, or indeed manoeuvres depending on where you stand. The film sector today, as it did in the 1980s, still marginalises black filmmakers and black films. The state today, as in the 1980s, still occupies a contradictory space. One of the leading contemporary thinkers around the aesthetics of the black radical tradition, Fred Moten, speaks about this in-out quandary. He speaks about the importance of being in the frame, of being in the hold, because it's only, he says, by being in it that radical ideas of freedom can be produced, even if one might have flights of fantasy based around evacuating that space, no matter how discriminatory it might be. And it's useful to position Bell Hook's idea about radical openness against Motom's hypothesis here. As I draw to a close, it seems to me that this predicament about the margins and centre, which was spoken about in the 1980s, remains one of the critical concerns around from where current strategies for black cultural production might be built. Hall spoke about the conjuncture of the relations of representation, which today pertains to issues still of access, labour and precarity, and the conjuncture of the politics of representation based on the contested meanings that representation always opens itself up to. Now, if these two things are still in the frame, as it were, then it seems to me that we can speak of a new stage or problem or struggle, which is around the spaces of representation. How do we start to address the problem of from what spaces black cultural production can be most effectively presenced, positioned in a way that moves beyond the restrictions that I've been describing? And I hope that we use Black Film British Cinema version 2 to explore these and other questions, and to consider black film in all of its variety, which I know we will do over the next 2 days. But I also hope that we use this occasion to address, because I know we have a range of people in this room, to address and challenge past and present, sometimes overbearing forms of governance that have simultaneously helped to demarginalise, but also remarginalise, and have therefore shaped the possibilities of the very black film as British cinema that we're even able to assemble ourselves around 30 years on. Thank you.